you?
I'm better for seeing you. Thanks so much for
That's a nice
doing
dodge.
the podcast and everything.
For sure.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I haven't talked to you for quite a long while. I mean,
No,
I don't know if you know my husband died.
yeah, I was actually following
Yeah.
that closely. And I was watching you cope and process while all of that was rolling through. And, it wasn't the sort of thing I was going to write you a letter and go, gee, thanks for modeling. But since we're here, it was really, it was horrible to watch because it's horrible.
Yeah.
But I really learned a lot about resilience and, I'm no stranger to grief, AIDS years, but it's been a while since I've been dipped into it so deeply, and to be reminded and to see how you modeled all that was really quite something and impressive and important for me. So thank you.
Well, I so appreciate the acknowledgement. It's, I think, I always say, there's only certain things that will lead you into what I would say is like a moment of spiritual enlightenment. Either somebody's died, you've had a near-death experience, or you've done a psychedelic to lift the veil on human reality. And then suddenly you realize that this idea that we're all connected and we're all one thing. And this is kind of like a matrix that my brain is creating this outrageous illusion in front of me that we call it life. And I think it really, it broke a part of me, I think. I always say, like, the cracks in my heart are where the light's shining through, though.
There's a Hasidic rabbi from the late 18th century who also said, the only heart which is whole is the heart which has been broken.
Yeah. I think that those are the things, like, I'm glad I have a little bit of a Buddhist practice where meditation is a daily practice for me to just sit and separate my emotional self from my spirit, to allow me to be stronger than my emotions.
And you just have to keep going. And it becomes a part of you. And, and we wouldn't want it any other way. These people who are gone were great gifts. But then, and time, that's a gift too. But yeah, it breaks something.
Like, if ever I was sure that I was here for a reason and that I am a light of God and I am a piece of a universe that is more than what this reality is, and that I am really just a spirit occupying a body and using a mind to have a human experience for spiritual enlightenment, I got it. I got it. It really was it was a real blessing for me. You know what I mean? It really, really kind of pulled me out of a piece of it. And that's when I started saying, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to share some of my journal. I'm just going to put it out there because I almost needed to do it for myself. And what was beautiful were the private messages I would get from people who were going through a similar effect, and you just don't realize it. And they would say the same thing. I've never heard somebody so graciously go through, and they know the trauma that's happening in the family, like how you so graciously try to explain this in a way that is connecting, not separating. You're not living in the grief. You're trying to realize grief is love with nowhere to go. And, it's like you're showing this deeper side of your spirituality. And I thought, maybe that's what he was here for, is to allow me to not just be Sue, the creator of the melt method and this fascia thing. And, because I feel like I have so many more things to talk about. And that's actually why Anatomical Gangster became a thing. Is, I have constantly felt like an outcast pushing the boundaries of the traditional science world. And I always say the collegiate world, right, proceeds one funeral at a time.
Right.
And
my favorite quote of the 21st century.
It's so true, right?
Nazis don't change their mind; they just die.
Exactly right.
Get replaced.
And that's it. So I thought what is so incredible about the fascia community is that we are all connected. And the idea of connective tissue being the thing that's linking.
Right. The metaphor that is the thing itself. Yeah.
It's so brilliant. And so, someone like you, when you spoke and presented your paper and then started to really talk about it, I thought was really awesome. But then when I also got to learn a little bit more about you and who you are, and, the Buddhist practice that you have, and what you've done, and just you shared some of your personal life as well. And it just is like, it's so, I mean, you are like an anatomical gangster, right? Is that you've got the science brain, but you also understand that spirituality is something that science can't really define. And so there's a crack in the pieces, but what a great thing to be able to talk to a doctor, a researcher, somebody, who's a pathologist, and somebody who has a spiritual practice. Is like, that's kind of what I want to talk a little bit about. Sure. Is just I want you to share a little bit about who you are, and and like your background, and then when this whole fascia thing came up, and this discovery that you had where you were like, there's something there, and then that one moment then catapulting you into this entire world of fascia people. And now, you're working with Carla Stecco, and it's like, it's so incredible. These are like pioneering moments for me to be able to share that with people and be like, I don't think people realize how huge this is, but I've been in this whole world for now about 25 years, from the point of being in fitness. And then when I got into pain in the late 90s, and like the internet came out, and this whole, plantar fasciitis, like, so inflamed fascia is causing me this pain thing. And if that's the case, there's no exercise for that. And typing in fascia into Google and finding this world that was like, what is this? Yeah. And why isn't everybody talking about it? And why is it so controversial? and that's the crazy thing, is it's still a little controversial. There's still
more than a little.
They're like, you're not going to tell people that fascia is a relevant thing that's a living matter. And I'm like, I remember saying that to Gil. I said to him, well, fascia is like a non-living matter with inactive properties. And he goes, why would you have a non-living matter inside a living body? And I was like,
oh, good question.
What the hell you're talking about? But that actually makes a lot of sense. So, I think that this is what's so brilliant is, again, you have this vast background as a clinician, a doctor, and like, how do you go from doctor to actually having to shed some of the chains to be able to open your mind to other possibilities? And again, you have this whole background in spirituality, which is like mind freaking blowing for a physician, but how brilliant that is. I mean, to have both sides of the coin is like, you're a unicorn.
They're not really. I mean, they may be relatively uncommon, but they're more common than you'd think. For example, do you know who Barbara McClintock was?
No. Oh, maybe I do.
Won the Nobel Prize for discovering transposons in the genome. And her story is really extraordinary. A book about her called A Feeling for the Organism by Elizabeth Fox Keller, I think. And she interviewed Barbara McClintock. Now, the thing about McClintock was that she was born the year of the rediscovery of Gregor Mendel. So when genetics actually became a thing based on Mendel, she was born that year in my hometown, Hartford. She went on to become, I think, the youngest, but definitely the first woman head of the American Genetics Association in the 20s, when she was in her late 20s. And she studied corn plants, the colors of the kernels and the stripes on the leaves, and could make observations and conclusions about what was happening in their genome by looking at the patterns. And while she was doing that, the world of genetics was starting to move to study Drosophila flies. And because they're easy, they turn over many generations really quickly. And so the genetics world, really, tons of it is based on what happens in flies. She was like, I study corn plants. She eventually had a cornfield, a plot of land at Cold Spring Harbor that they allowed her to have, kind of out of respect for who she had been. No one really understood what she was talking about. She would come out with these papers that were very complex. And basically what happened is that, and she says, the title of the book comes from something she said about how, why would she leave the corn plants as her method of study? Because she had a feeling for the organism. Spending so much time intimately with them, she couldn't just switch to another model system because she had this feeling, this intuition. And years go by and she does her stuff and everyone respects her, but thinks, well, whatever, corn. And then she wins the Nobel Prize. So she got that affirmation that in fact, but my understanding of her is that, and you sort of sense it between the words in the book, though she doesn't state it, she was a meditator. And, you know, you said, so there's the doctor thing and I do this, and then there's that spiritual thing. How does that happen? The two were actually, the meditation came before the doctor thing. And, you know, I do Zen practice in particular. And if Zen cultivates any particular aspect, well, one particular aspect of mind that Zen specifically cultivates is experiencing the moment fresh. And it does that, unlike most other Buddhist practices, through koan practice, like what's the sound of one hand clapping? That's not the answer. There's an analytic aspect. You have text or words. You know, another famous one is, and it's often a monk and or a student and a teacher having an interaction in which the student or disciple has some sort of awakening experience. So this monk comes to Master Chao-Chu and says, does a dog have Buddha nature? And of course a dog has Buddha nature because every living thing has Buddha nature, right? And Chao-Chu says, mu, which is Japanese for no or nothing or, you know, negation. And the student has an awakening experience. Now, so now you go in and demonstrate that to your teacher. You're supposed to become one with the koan. You're supposed to become one with mu. Well, try and do that with your intellect. You're not going to get very far. So, you know, I've studied a few hundred koans at this point. It inculcated in me the habit of, if I have a problem to solve, I can try and poke at it intellectually, but I know that's not likely the best way to get there. Just hold it in my awareness. And part of that is, can you be in the present moment unconditioned without depending on prior information or without an expectation of what kind of form the next moment will take. And my favorite quote that I throw at people all the time, one of my favorite quotes, is from Suzuki Roshi, who was the founder of San Francisco Zen Center. Has a famous book called Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind. And it comes from a phrase he used in a Dharma talk where he said, in the mind of the beginner, there are many possibilities. In the mind of the expert, there are few. So, you know, I'm sitting here with my microscope and I get a slide. This is a hunk of liver. And I put it under the microscope, and it's where my Zen practice merges to some extent with my doctor practice. Is my first thing is to simply be with the slide, see what's there and let it flow into me, the information my eyes are picking up, and see what comes out of that. I don't start with the clinical history and try and tick off a bunch of boxes and does it have this, does it not have that? I'll eventually get to that because that's part of the practice. But can I just sit with it? And when my clinicians came to me with this in vivo microscopy of the middle fiber connective tissue, fascia layer of the bile duct, and said, we see these spaces in it, we don't know what they are. And I was like, there are no spaces. They don't exist. I can show you pictures. I can show you slides.
Right.
And it turned out to be artifact. When I was in that state of, they had shown me the living tissue and I had the fixed tissue on the slide and they're not matching. Does a dog have Buddha nature? Moo. That's not an answer to that question. That question doesn't predicate that answer. And yet, in fact, where they meet, I had to just sort of be there until we could see, I could get out of my prior training and my assumptions about what the slide looked like. And it was a series of that. So then our paper came out, but I was still entrained by my allopathic medical school training, which defined fascia as this, meaning just musculoskeletal fascia, maybe include the periosteum, but and nothing else. And unfortunately, and I said this at the in my talk at the Fascia Congress, when I started to get this anger back from fascia people after we published, who said, like, this is nothing new, we've known this. Most sweetly and affectionately now, I think back on the first angry emails I got from Jean-Claude Gimbertot.
I can only imagine his response was, how dare you speak of my.
And I was like, I don't know what I just stepped into the middle of. And so for you who were there, or those people who have seen the viral video of him responding to my talk positively, you don't know, when I saw him stand up, how terrified I was, because I was aware of him sitting there judging and assessing the moment I started talking, because we had that prior email and we had engaged each other the day before and it was okay, but I still felt, and when he stood up to take the microphone, as they were about to end the session, I thought, oh, what's going to happen? And it turned out, anyone watching this podcast can Google the video. It's easy to come up on YouTube. It was wonderful.
Yes.
And
transformative even.
Yeah. And I think for everyone in the room.
It was truly a link of, because, he's a French hand surgeon who was doing these flexor tendon reversals for years. Yeah. And then somehow or other, same thing. It's like, why is this not staying still? Right. What is this that I'm looking at? And it's the same thing. It's like, almost like you're not supposed to look at that, or it had almost been disguised. And I thought that was what was so compelling when you were talking about the spaces that you're seeing, is like, you're just thinking, oh, it's from the knife we're creating, it's a remnant, right? It's an artifact. And then suddenly going, what if it's not an artifact? Or what was like wait a minute, maybe that isn't an artifact? Where was that aha?
Right. Well, it was it was I would have to actually show you the pictures. The aha moment is figure 1D in our original paper. I couldn't get these things to match. And it was similar. I think it must be similar to his experience of, he had been taught something and what he was seeing was different. And it takes a while to you can't even focus them, your eyes can't get them to merge into a single image. So there's this dissonance. And then you're stuck because you've been trained so deeply.
Right. Your analytical brain is saying no. And right. Your other brain is going, but I'm seeing it.
Right. So there were actually two moments in this where it was very vivid. The first was, I knew something was changing in the tissue when we go from the living to here to the slide. So I need to break down every single step along the way to see where it disappears. And so the original study was, they had been reporting these spaces, 7 or 8 years, the scope had been in use, clinical use. but no one had really engaged it in a meaningful fashion. So what we did was, it was first being seen in the bile duct, the extrahepatic bile duct, the large bile duct draining the liver. And that goes through the pancreas. And so we knew that surgeons taking out a pancreas because of pancreatic cancer would be taking out the bile duct too. Mm-hmm. So what we arranged to do with IRB approval, et cetera, patients signed consent, et cetera, they were put under anesthesia for their surgical resection of their cancer. But before they started that operation, patients under anesthetic, they put the endoscope down, looked in to see the bile duct, and you injected a fluorescent dye in the vein, and it rapidly moves through all the fluid spaces of the body. So within minutes, the wall of the bile duct would light up with these spaces. So we saw it, it's there, took a picture. Then the surgeon takes out the pancreas with the duct and runs it down to the pathology lab, open up the bile duct, bring the scope down, put the scope there, it's still there, there are the spaces. Take a little biopsy of it to make a frozen section, put it in the, there's this embedding medium that you freeze to make, you have to make tissues stiff enough to cut very thin for a frozen section during an operation. Like if someone has potentially breast cancer and you want to confirm that it's cancer during the operation, so they should know to go take lymph nodes, for example. We do this. So we took a piece of this area we had just looked at that has the spaces of the bile duct, froze it, put the scope on the frozen tissue. It's still there. Cut the slide down to the level that the scope was seeing, looked at it under a fluorescent microscope. It's still there. Took the tissue, put it in formaldehyde to fix it, to make permanent slides out of it. It disappears. Uh-huh. But now we had the tissue with the spaces on the slide, mm-hmm. the frozen tissue. And we could compare it to the fixed tissue. And then it was just obvious. There are spaces. It's just that when you take it out, the water drains, it dehydrates, the collagen bundles collapse from this to this. And all these little cracks in the tissue that we used to think are artifact because collagen is so stiff, the blade sort of shatters the tissue. No, those are remnants of the real space.
I always say that it's incredible over the last 25 years how science and technology, really over the last 100 years, but the last 25 years where science and technology has really allowed us to look at things, but it's not the science and technology, it's the curious minds who are utilizing the science and technology and actually going, well, wait a minute, let's go back and retrace the steps because something's off, and to figure out what was off. And that I feel is not always the inquiry in the medical world. It's a box, like, oh, well, if you have this symptom and this symptom is this, and this is how we're going to treat it because this is how we always do. So with those kind of discoveries that you've been able to present to your medical cohorts, how would that then change a surgery or how doctors treat a tissue? Do you think that this will ultimately lead to new discoveries, or is it still you're showing them that and they're like, yes, so what, let's just keep doing?
Yeah. So first off, as you've implied, it turned out not to simply be just the lining of the bile duct. It turns out to be every fibrous tissue in the body. In the fascia world, the decision has been made to call all those tissues fascia, although in the last edition, as I kind of delight in pointing out, dermis was not included in that, but in our paper, we did include it. So even in the world of fascia, which is extending the definition of fascia as broadly as anyone on the planet, even they still excluded some aspects.
Why though? Why? Like, why is under the skin's layer not fascia? Because if you look at Gil Hedley's work, and he, I was with him when they took the superficial fascia and he took a meat tenderizer and massaged all of the fat out of it. And what you have is this glorious honeycomb looking tensegrity architecture right from the skin on down. How can you not call that fascia?
Well, but under the skin. That's the subcutaneous tissue, and
Right.
that's the subcutaneous fascia. But the dermis itself above it just looked like a dense connective tissue layer. And for some reason, there's this lovely, I hope Carla forgives me for poking at this, but in her textbook, there's a lovely diagram of the layers of fascia beneath the skin, and the fascia is colored one way, but the dermis is colored something else. Um, so, though I think the history of the nomenclature of fascia has been to continually expand what fascia encompasses. And a problem, so there are a couple of problems between that approach and the classical allopathic, and I wouldn't say Western, because osteopathy is Western too, but what we think of as Western medicine and biology, which is sort of what we do in orthodox medical schools and academic medical centers, the word fascia denotes musculoskeletal fascia. So the moment you talk about other things as being fascia, from a definitional standpoint, that doesn't make any sense. Secondly, if you look at not all, but much of the work in fascia, it's coming out of clinical practice and clinical intuitions. Even if those people producing this are medical doctors, it's still considered intuition. That's not science. And if you're not an MD, can you even trust those intuitions?
Well, you're not supposed to, I guess. I mean, I think that was, for me, I guess this is going back to the early 2000s. Before I had coined the term melt, I had met Tom Findlay, and I kept saying to him, everybody's always talking about the collagen matrix, always the collagen matrix. I said, what about the fluid perfusion that's moving through the matrix? It seems to me that when I put my hands on a person, there's a frequency that I feel, and I can't tell you how. It's just, this is my knack of what I can do. And just under that superficial and just above what would be called a deep membrane, there's fluid that I can really key into. And if I get really quiet with the body, I'm telling you, it's going through everything. And there's no separation in it at all. How come nobody talks about that? He goes, because nobody's going to sit there and try to figure out a way to define it. And it's too complex an idea to define. And so, but today, people are talking about the fluid flow of fascia and fluid perfusion, right? When Peter Friedel talked about the pre-lymphatic channels and that they're conduits that are moving the fluid from fascia into lymph, this to me seems like a huge conversation that nobody's having. And even when you were talking about classification, we could talk about fascial tissue, but I would bear to say, isn't it a system? It's not a tissue, it's a system. Could we call it a system?
And I got yelled at for saying it should be considered an organ,
Right.
And most of the world was saying, are you crazy? It's just matrix. And a smaller portion of the world was going, are you crazy? You think this is new? and I have to say, another story I like to tell is I was presenting, this came after the Fascia Congress, after I had made up with you guys and we became friends. Which required a completely appropriate apology from me. Let me just step back to that one point, and then I'll go to the other one. I didn't know about all this work because it isn't generally published in the searchable journals, peer-reviewed journals online. So when I was looking for prior work, I wasn't thinking about searching the word fascia. I included fascia in the paper, but that was kind of an incidental as sort of like a surprise gift to my friend who was a Rolfer and cranial sacral worker who'd been telling me there's fluid in there for years. And I said, no, there's not. And I decided, let's look at that too. And there's fluid. But I didn't have the word fascia as a primary search term. I was looking for interstitial spaces. None of those papers talk about fascia. And none of them talk about spaces this size. So it seemed new. It occurred to me then that, why, you should have been pumping. I still put it back on your community. Why aren't you publishing this stuff where I could find it? And then I realized, because I bet my community wouldn't publish it. The censorship that goes on here, because it isn't reproducible, testable, hypothesis-driven stuff. It's based on deep clinical intuitions. Some of that can get published, but even then, it still has to be closely associated with the standard form. Mm-hmm. So I think that my understanding, for many of you, perhaps it just wasn't the place to put it. Pardon me. But I think that even if you had tried, it probably, and if people did try, it probably wasn't accepted. So there's the whole issue of censorship. But then there's also everyone coming from a different view. So I was in China consulting for liver stuff, because liver is my main thing. But they asked me to present on the interstitium paper. And I had already just been recently to the Berlin Congress and sort of had now a fuller idea of the context for what we were doing. And the head of the, what would be considered the China's NIH for traditional Chinese medicine was in the audience and got first question out of honor and respect for who he was. And his first question to me was, how have people responded to this work? And I said, well, it's been a mixed bag. So there's the osteopathy world and the fascia world who were, really angry because I was calling something new that they had been talking about for 40 or 50 years, 60 years. And he laughed and he said, yes, and we've been speaking about it for 4,000.
There it is. And I mean, there's your full circle. And I hope everybody's hearing this, because if you think about Jin and Jin Yi, right, and Qi, I mean, I always say, dare I say that fascia is the Qi system of the body. Oh my God, don't say that. And I'm like, well, think about it. Jin, Jin Yi, the life essence, the flow. They're talking about it. And the frequency, I mean, it has a frequency to it. It has a vibration to it. So all of these things that have been around for everywhere in Eastern medicine and writing, why is it that we fail to apply it more in the Western world? It doesn't make any sense.
Well, and one of my ambitions, and I actually have someone who's willing to fund this, but it got kiboshed by COVID. And I'm waiting for travel to become possible again, because I don't think this can be done online. My dream is there are people from all sorts of healing practice cultures around the world that looked at our paper and said, I recognize something. Ayurvedic, acupuncture, energy medicine, East Asian, Chinese practices, Japanese practices, shamanic practices, osteopaths, Rolfers, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. They all saw something in this anatomy that was mapping to what their clinical intuitions and clinical practices and clinical therapeutic capacities were pointing to. But they were all recognizing different pieces of it. My dream is to have a small group of people, no more than 15, between 12 and 15, because I found through Liver World that 12 to 15 people is an optimum group to have enough people that there's a diversity of opinions, but not so many that it becomes a person talking to a room rather than a conversation. Mm-hmm. And my dream is to have this go for a few days, have representatives who are authoritative from these various communities come together. And the first day or 2 days, there's no talking. We have treatment rooms, and everyone gets to experience a session of everyone else's practice, just to see what they experience. Then come in and let's present the update to this thing that people are recognizing. That I was talking about as interstitium, the fascia world talks about as fascia, blah, 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 it doesn't matter. Let's get what is reproducible science, testable traditional science there on the table, and then let everyone start to riff on that and see what comes. I don't care what the output is. I know there will be an output. And my dream of it is that that could become the beginning of an actual global culture of health. And that maybe, like you described, the fascia is sort of both the thing and the metaphor for the people who study the thing. Can the interstitium fascia fiber connective network, whatever word we apply to this thing that exists and doesn't care what we name it, can it be the connective tissue that and communication network that allows all of us to talk to each other and understand each other?
Yeah.
And integrate.
It could. I mean, it seems like we're in a paradigm right now where even when you look at what NASA is looking at in the universe, right? I mean, I always feel like my body is the metaphor for the universe. I close my eyes and it is the vast matrix of the world that is outside of our planet. And then you think, well, what's holding the planets together is dark matter, which is the fabric that nobody was talking about because it's dark matter. But isn't that similar to what fascia is as the thread? It's something, it's the same thing.
And the thing we didn't have the capacity to see, either because we didn't have the techniques or we didn't have the desire to see it.
Exactly. I mean, it's so in plain sight and we're chucking it in the bucket to get to the good stuff all the time.
Right.
Suddenly you have the atomic force microscopy and, looking at these things with, high powered microscopes and then saying, this stuff is in a constant state of adaptation, a constant state of change. And again, it becomes such a metaphor for the impermanence of life. And so I always think to myself, if every medical doctor was almost forced into having some sort of a Buddha nature, more of a Buddha practice, they might do similar to what you did, where you're, in a sense, it's got to be a bit of a meditation in a sense when you're looking at that microscope and, you're going into this microscopic land of what am I seeing? And I always think it's interesting looking through a microscope that if you raise the focal point, that you're looking at it in a different level, you're going to see something else. And it's very similar to, the world around us that everything is always so the same, but if we just stop and really kind of uncover a couple little pieces, there's all this opportunity and all this transformation that's constantly happening, this idea of being stuck, I can't change, I can't do. And I think that's also why so many people have pain is it's a suffering. It becomes almost a choice. Like I want to suffer, but I don't even know that I'm doing it. And I think that this is also what connective tissue offers, is a moment to quiet down and to sort of disassociate the mind-body connection and just realize that it's all one big thing. And when we start to look more globally at the body, I think there's new messages that are going to help more and more people. And I love this idea of having the dirty dozen come together and share their work together. I mean, I've always had those opportunities where you're working with other people and you're hearing similarities and differences, but it's oftentimes it's in the differences that you find this incredible middle ground that gives you this new medium to work with, that gives you, I mean, you leave thinking so much bigger than where you were when you came into the room.
But, I would throw in a caution. Going back to what you said about how you're able to experience the fluid flow when you touch someone's skin, and that there's a frequency. I have no idea what you're talking about.
I get it.
And not because I haven't been trained, but because, I've become really aware, partly through doing this work, but I've become very aware, and partly through my Zen practice, partly because I have Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, so I tear easily, so I'm in physical therapy all the time, and I'm very aware of my physical limitations and blah, blah, blah. We all have such profoundly different fundamental awarenesses and intuitions that we have access to. I am so profoundly detached from my physical being by habit. I think I know where it came from. It has to do with my loose ligaments when I was trying to learn to crawl, blah, blah, blah. Well, I never crawled because I couldn't, wobbly. And then I was walking. But, and in my physical therapy session today, this came up because while I was doing a very simple sort of stretch thing, once again, my trainer in my PT facility said, "You're not breathing." I can't even encompass my breath as part of my physical being when engaging my physical being. I don't sort of have a sense that comes easily of the backside of my body. So in the Zendo, what I think feels upright when I'm sitting in a meditation pose in Zazen, I'm always actually leaning forward like this, and the moderator who might be passing by gently brings me back to here. And that feels to me like I'm going to fall over backwards, even though it's upright. There are so, and yet, and that makes me feel bad. But then I think, oh, but I have intuitions with my mind that constantly surprise people. So I have that too. It's just in that realm. It's not in this realm. So to some extent, I think we have to be mindful that all of us, most of us, I would hope everybody to some extent, though I think our practices in our culture of living in human-made environments, chained to devices that are non-human, unable to see the night sky, little fragments of nature peeking through the cement, that sort of abstraction from the natural world, I think, inhibits access to these kinds of intuitions and awareness. But I think that we also all have to be mindful that even if we were, there were some people in hunter-gatherer societies that were the shamans because to them the world was so transparent, and others were not. How do we allow ourselves to both understand other people's and value other people's intuitions that we may not be able to experience? The flip side is, can we allow people, I'm trying to think of a gentle word, I don't want to say, my lack of understanding of the space back here. It's not ignorance, but, it's an absence of sensation, of perception, of intuition. There are people who get angry at me because I can't sit up straight. Like, no, that's okay. I'm differently abled.
Yeah, maybe your nervous system thinks your center of gravity is slightly more, in a place.
Well, it clearly does. It clearly does. Yeah. But the thing is that so much of the practices in all these communities turn into sort of this confrontational dialectic of you're not listening to me. Mm-hmm. And it's kind of why I would want to start this kind of conference off with no talking. Because if we, if you take someone who doesn't believe in Rolfing and you give them a Rolfing session, they're gonna get it. But if you try to explain to me, the liver pathologist, that there's fluid in the body, I'm sorry, it's not there. It's not through talking that this stuff transforms people.
That's right.
And at the same time, as in Zen, we say that it's the transmission that's beyond words. And yet, as my Zen teacher says to me, and has probably often been written, there's no branch of Buddhism that has written more words about it than Zen. Both are required. And it requires a lot of humility, both to understand that other people may have perceptions that are valid that you don't. And that's because people are different. And at the same time, for people who have those perceptions to be understanding that it may make no sense when just conveyed verbally, because to me, for 10 years, I was pretty consistent with an Iyengar yoga practice. I never understood the direction to bring my breath into my posture. I'm just starting to figure that out in physical therapy because I'm now willing to listen to it and get it. So,
Yeah, I mean, it's huge what you're saying. I mean, it's this is great as we're coming to the end of this, because one of the things in Melt, I always start with people is saying, if you want to change something, you have to give yourself permission to go into your body and just sense what you're feeling, and don't judge it. Don't even question it. Just feel your way through it. And then if you want to create change, sometimes what it is when we feel a lack of change is a lack of control. And I always think it's incredible that out of all of the autonomic systems, all of the autonomic things that happen, there's this one really, really important one that we can consciously take over really, really easily without being taught how to do it. And that's inviting somebody to breathe in and then stay in the inhale until you're ready to exhale. And that's big. That's a huge thing, right? Is that I can take the thought to breathe in and choose to breathe out, choose to let go. Yeah. And that to me is the first step in transformation, is to come back to the thing that keeps us alive is this inhale and this exhale, breathing in something new, breathing out something old, to create change, to become more aware, to appreciate that I'm not this body and I'm not this mind. I'm a spirit occupying this body and mind to have a human experience. And it is with other people that the connections, I always say, is what makes life so rich. It's not what I do. It's not my accomplishments or my discoveries. It's how it connects. And I mean, we started the conversation in the exact same place, oddly enough, that we're ending, is this idea that connective tissue is what's also brought so many of us together to create inquiry about the incredible question of who am I?
Yeah.
Yes. Indeed. Well, Neil, I mean, incredible what you've already accomplished. And I'm so excited that you and Carla Stecco are on a new mission. Tell me a little bit about what you guys are doing.
So along with Caterina Fedi, who's her postdoc, and my collaborator on all this stuff, Becky Wells down at University of Pennsylvania, and her postdoc, Jess Llewellyn, we've been studying what we call the capsule of the liver, and I think Carla calls the visceral fascia of the liver. Whatever we call it, we're looking at combining her insights about fasciocytes and our ways of studying the cells in that layer and seeing how the capsule changes in disease. And it clearly is not just this minor passive thing. There are dynamic aspects to its baseline state in terms of how it functions and what its capacities are for moving, for flowing, for communicating, for containing, but expanding. And then what happens in chronic liver disease and how it changes. And so Katerina came to Philly actually for many months to learn some of the techniques they were doing in Becky's lab. And then they're collecting tissues there, and we're all smushing it together and working towards a paper that's going to be important, I think, for liver disease, like how we define cirrhosis, but I think equally important to show what happens when you do an interdisciplinary approach to this tissue and how rich the information you get if you have collaborators coming from different fields with different techniques and putting them together to look at the same thing. It's much more than additive. The synergy is really exciting. The data is just starting to come together. Jess just sent us sort of a summary of everything. We're gathering a few more things, and I think probably in a handful of months, we'll start writing a paper. And we keep going from there. And we're all learning from each other. I mean, it's just, it's a joyous, delightful process, which is nice considering it's also work.
Indeed it is. Well, it's just so wonderful to see you and that you're thriving and just still as awesome as ever. And Yeah, just thanks so much for being such an incredible anatomical gangster and thinking out of the box from the traditional confines that we have. And for those of you guys who are listening, I hope that you'll tune back in next week for another live show on the Anatomical Gangster Hour. But for right now, I'm Sue Hitzman. See you soon.